Picture this. The year is 2024, and you walk into any bookstore, library, or hotel room in the world. You search every shelf, every drawer, every digital database, but you find nothing. No Genesis, no Psalms, no Gospels, no Revelation. The most influential book in human history simply doesn't exist. Over 2 billion people wake up tomorrow with no biblical foundation for their faith, their laws, or their understanding of right and wrong. What kind of world would we be living in right now? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Let's travel back to the ancient world, where sacred words were first being carved into stone, written on papyrus, and whispered from generation to generation. This is the story of humanity's most powerful book, and what happens when it never comes to be. Chapter 1: The Sacred Collection. For over 1,500 years, something incredible was happening across the ancient world. In the scorching desert of Mount Sinai, Moses received stone tablets directly from the finger of God. In the hills of Judea, King David composed psalms that would comfort millions for thousands of years. In the dusty streets of first-century Palestine, fishermen and tax collectors frantically wrote down every word Jesus spoke, knowing they were recording the most important message in human history. But these weren't just random writings scattered across time and space. Each scroll, each letter, each carefully preserved oral tradition was part of something much bigger. Ancient Jewish scribes protected the Torah with their lives, copying every letter with perfect precision. Early Christian communities passed letters from the apostles from house to house, reading them aloud by candlelight as Roman soldiers patrolled outside. The book of Genesis told humanity where we came from. The Psalms gave us songs for our deepest pain and highest joy. The Gospels showed us how to love our enemies. Paul's letters taught scattered communities how to live together in peace. John's revelation promised that evil would not have the final word. By 400 AD, church leaders gathered in great councils to make one of history's most important decisions. Which of the hundreds of religious texts floating around the ancient world deserved to be called Holy Scripture? Which books had the divine authority to guide human civilization? They debated, they prayed, they argued. Finally, they chose 66 books out of hundreds of possibilities. This wasn't just creating a religious text. This was creating the moral foundation that would guide kings and peasants, scientists and artists for the next 2,000 years. The Bible became humanity's instruction manual for justice, mercy, forgiveness, and hope. But what if that crucial moment in 400 AD had gone very differently? Chapter 2: The Moment of Power. The Roman Emperor Constantine stood at a crossroads that would change everything. In 312 AD, he claimed to see a cross in the sky before a major battle, with words that promised victory through Christ. When he won that battle, Constantine didn't just become emperor. He became the first ruler to make Christianity the official religion of the most powerful empire on earth. Suddenly, scattered Christian communities that had been hiding in caves and meeting in secret found themselves in marble palaces. The Bible went from being a forbidden book that could get you killed to being the law that determined who lived and who died. Kings across Europe claimed divine authority based on biblical passages. Entire armies marched to war, carrying crosses and shouting verses from the Psalms. The Bible didn't just influence politics, It became politics. Medieval kings said God chose them to rule because the Bible taught divine right of kings. European explorers justified conquering new continents because Jesus commanded them to spread the gospel to all nations. Even rebellions and revolutions quoted biblical heroes like Moses, leading the Israelites out of slavery. For 2,000 years, the Bible shaped everything. It inspired the greatest art, music, and literature in human history. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling with biblical scenes. Bach composed hymns that lifted human hearts toward heaven. Shakespeare filled his plays with biblical references that everyone understood. But the Bible also justified terrible things. Slavery was defended using verses about servants obeying masters. Women were kept powerless because of passages about wives submitting to husbands. Wars were fought over different interpretations of the same holy text. The Crusades, the Inquisition, countless religious wars, all claimed biblical authority. One book became the foundation for universities, hospitals, and orphanages. The same book was used to burn heretics and launch witch hunts. It gave humanity its highest moral ideals and its most terrifying religious extremism. But what if none of this had ever happened? What if the year 400 AD arrived and the biblical compilation simply failed? Chapter 3: The Silence. Imagine the church councils of 400 AD erupting into chaos. Bishops from different regions arrive carrying completely different collections of sacred texts. The Eastern churches insist on keeping books that the Western churches call heretical. Arguments break out over the Gospel of Thomas, the letters of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas. Instead of reaching agreement, the councils collapse in bitter division. Decades pass. Church leaders try again and again to create a unified holy book, but they cannot agree. Political pressure mounts as the Roman Empire weakens and needs religious unity to survive. But every attempt to force biblical agreement only creates more splits, more arguments, more competing versions of Christianity. By 450 AD, it becomes clear that no single biblical canon will ever emerge. The scrolls and letters that could have become the Bible remain scattered in different churches, different communities, different languages. Some congregations follow the teachings of Paul. Others prefer the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Still others create entirely new traditions based on local revelations and dreams. The moment that should have unified Christianity instead destroys any hope of Christian unity forever. Without a central sacred text to provide authority, every Christian community becomes its own little church with its own beliefs. Some worship Jesus as God. Others see him as a wise teacher. Still others believe he was just a symbol for the divine spark within every human soul. Jewish communities face a similar crisis. Without the pressure to compete with Christian biblical authority, different rabbinical schools develop completely different interpretations of Jewish law and practice. The oral traditions that could have been written down and preserved instead evolve in dozens of different directions across different regions. The religious foundation that was supposed to anchor Western civilization simply never appears. By 500 AD, the spiritual landscape of the world looks nothing like what we know from our timeline. The silence where the Bible should have been echoes across continents, leaving humanity to find completely different answers to the deepest questions of existence. Chapter 4: Faiths in Chaos. Without biblical authority to settle disputes, early Christianity explodes into religious chaos, unlike anything in history. In Rome, followers of Peter teach that Jesus was fully divine and never truly human. In Alexandria, disciples of Thomas insist that Jesus was fully human and never truly divine. In Antioch, communities following Mary Magdalene claim she received secret teachings that Jesus never shared with the male apostles. The Gnostic Christians, who always believed that salvation came through hidden knowledge rather than faith, suddenly find themselves without biblical opposition. Their secret gospels spread rapidly across the Mediterranean. They teach that the physical world is evil, created by a false god, and that humans must escape matter to reach the true divine realm through mystical knowledge. In Gaul and Britain, Celtic Christians blend Jesus' teachings with ancient Druid wisdom. They worship in sacred groves, celebrate the divine feminine alongside Christ, and develop completely different understandings of death and resurrection. Spanish Christians mix biblical stories with local Iberian religious traditions, creating new myths about Jesus visiting their lands. Meanwhile, Judaism splinters just as dramatically. Without the need to define themselves against Christian biblical claims, different Jewish communities develop along regional lines. Babylonian Jews focus intensely on mystical Kabbalah traditions. Palestinian Jews maintain temple sacrificial practices. European Jewish communities blend with local pagan traditions in ways that would have been impossible with strong biblical boundaries. New religions emerge from the spiritual vacuum. Mystery cults that had been dying out suddenly experience massive revivals as people search for meaning without biblical guidance. The cult of Mithras attracts former Christians seeking military-style discipline. Followers of Isis draw women seeking goddess worship. Neoplatonic philosophy schools become almost religious movements as educated people look for spiritual truth through reason rather than revelation. By 600 AD, the religious map of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East looks like a patchwork quilt of competing spiritual movements. No single tradition has enough authority or unity to provide the social glue that religion provided in our timeline. The stage is set for civilizational changes that will reshape human history in ways no one can predict. Chapter 5: The First Ripple. The Roman Empire, already weakening under barbarian pressure and economic collapse, faces a crisis it cannot survive. In our timeline, Christianity provided the unity that helped hold the empire together during its final centuries. Bishops became civic leaders. Biblical morality gave diverse populations shared values. Christian communities cared for the poor and sick when government services failed. But in this alternate world, religious chaos accelerates imperial collapse. Different regions follow different spiritual leaders with conflicting teachings about authority, law, and social order. When Gothic tribes cross the Danube, they find not a unified Christian empire, but a confusing collection of competing religious communities that cannot coordinate effective resistance. The sack of Rome in 476 AD happens faster and more completely because there's no unified church structure to preserve order and knowledge. Without biblical monasteries carefully copying classical texts, much ancient wisdom disappears forever. Greek philosophy, Roman law, and scientific knowledge vanish into the chaos as different religious groups focus on preserving their own particular traditions. But this also creates unexpected opportunities. In North Africa, Berber communities that had been converting to Christianity instead maintain their traditional religions while adopting useful Christian ideas about healing and community organization. In Britain, Celtic traditions survive Roman withdrawal much more successfully without pressure from biblical Christianity. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople faces different challenges. Without Western biblical unity to compete with, Orthodox Christianity develops along more mystical and philosophical lines. But they also have to deal with more diverse religious communities within their borders, as different groups resist central religious authority. By 550 AD, the classical world has ended, not with Christian preservation of ancient wisdom, but with complete fragmentation. Europe enters a period that's darker than the traditional Dark Ages, because there's no unified church to provide education, legal systems, or social services. But this darkness also creates space for completely different forms of human development to emerge. The first great ripple of biblical absence has swept across the ancient world. Now much larger waves are building that will reshape everything from science and art to politics and war in ways that will echo across the next 1,000 years. Chapter 6: The Dark Ages That Never Were. In our timeline, Christian monasteries became the libraries of the Dark Ages. Monks carefully preserved Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, and scientific knowledge, while Europe struggled through centuries of warfare and chaos. But without biblical Christianity to motivate this preservation work, classical learning follows completely different paths of survival. Islamic scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo become the sole inheritors of ancient wisdom. Without Christian monasteries as competitors, Islamic libraries grow even larger and more comprehensive. They preserve not just Greek and Roman texts, but also Persian, Indian, and Chinese knowledge that Christian monks might have ignored or rejected as pagan. But the Islamic world also develops differently, without biblical Christianity as their primary intellectual opponent. Islamic theologians spend less energy refuting Christian doctrines and more time exploring mystical Sufi traditions, advanced mathematics, and natural philosophy. The Islamic Golden Age becomes even more golden as intellectual resources aren't divided between preserving knowledge and debating Christians. In Asia, Buddhist monasteries suddenly find themselves with unexpected global influence. Tibetan Buddhist centers become major preservers of ancient wisdom as trade routes connect them with refugees fleeing European chaos. Buddhist concepts of impermanence, compassion, and mindful awareness begin spreading westward much earlier than in our timeline. African traditional religions maintain much stronger global presence without biblical missionary pressure. Ethiopian Orthodox communities develop fascinating blends of ancient African wisdom with Eastern Christian mysticism. West African religious centers become major intellectual hubs as Islamic and traditional African scholars work together without Christian competition. The most surprising development happens in remote European regions. Without biblical Christianity suppressing them as demonic, ancient pagan mystery schools experience incredible revivals. Celtic Druids in Ireland become sophisticated preservers of ancient oral traditions. Norse scholars in Scandinavia develop complex mythological systems that rival Greek philosophy in depth and beauty. Scientific development takes completely unexpected turns. Without biblical concepts of a rational creator making nature understandable through mathematics, European science might have developed more slowly. But without biblical restrictions on investigating certain topics, other sciences might have advanced much faster. Chapter 7: Crusades Never Happen. The medieval world unfolds along radically different lines without the Bible to justify holy war between Christianity and Islam. In our timeline, Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095 by claiming biblical authority to reclaim the Holy Land for Christ. But without unified biblical Christianity, no pope has the authority to call for such a massive religious war. Jerusalem remains primarily a Jewish and Islamic city with much more complex religious dynamics. Jewish communities, without Christian biblical claims challenging their connection to the land, maintain stronger political and religious presence. Different Islamic schools develop various relationships with local Jewish and Christian groups without the pressure of incoming Crusader armies. But this doesn't mean the medieval world becomes peaceful. Entirely different conflicts emerge from the new religious landscape. Celtic Christian communities in Ireland and Scotland launch raids against Anglo-Saxon pagan revivals in England, claiming divine visions rather than biblical authority. Moorish Spain faces resistance not from Christian Reconquista armies, but from various competing religious movements, including revived Roman mystery cults. The absence of crusades changes everything about medieval development. European military technology advances more slowly without the pressure of fighting in distant lands. But European trade with Asia develops much faster without religious warfare disrupting commercial relationships. Italian city-states become wealthy through peaceful commerce rather than financing holy wars. Knights and nobles find different outlets for their military energy. Some join Islamic jihad movements, attracted by Sufi mysticism and military brotherhood. Others become mercenaries for various competing European religious movements. Still others focus on purely secular conquests for wealth and land without religious justification. The most significant change involves intellectual exchange between civilizations. Without crusades creating bitter religious hatred, scholars from different traditions interact much more freely. Islamic libraries remain open to European visitors seeking ancient texts. Jewish scholars move between Islamic and European regions without fear of religious persecution for their role in the wrong side of holy wars. By 1200 AD, the medieval world has developed along completely different lines. Europe is more fragmented, but also more intellectually open. The Islamic world is more secure, but also faces different internal challenges. The stage is set for a renaissance that will be unlike anything we could recognize from our historical timeline. Chapter 8: The Renaissance Revolution. When the Renaissance begins around 1300 AD, it explodes in directions that would amaze us. In our timeline, Renaissance humanists struggled to balance classical learning with biblical authority. They had to carefully argue that studying pagan philosophy didn't threaten Christian faith. They faced constant pressure from church authorities who worried that too much ancient wisdom might undermine biblical teaching. But in this alternate world, Renaissance scholars face no such restrictions. They dive deeply into Greek philosophy, Roman literature, and ancient scientific texts without worrying about theological implications. Plato's mystical writings inspire new schools of thought that blend seamlessly with various Christian mystical traditions. Aristotle's logic becomes the foundation for entirely new approaches to understanding nature and society. Art develops along completely different paths when artists aren't primarily focused on biblical themes. Without the need to paint countless crucifixions, nativities, and biblical scenes for church patrons, Renaissance artists explore classical mythology, natural beauty, and human emotion in ways that seem almost modern to our eyes. The human body becomes a subject for celebration, rather than something that must be carefully balanced with spiritual themes. Scientific inquiry proceeds without religious interference in some areas, but also without religious motivation in others. In our timeline, many scientists studied nature because they believed God created an orderly universe that humans could understand through reason. Without this biblical foundation, some scientific development happens more slowly, but without religious restrictions on certain topics, other sciences advance much faster. Philosophy develops alternative moral frameworks without biblical influence. Renaissance thinkers create ethical systems based on classical virtue, mystical enlightenment, or pure rational analysis. Political theory evolves without biblical concepts of divine right or natural law derived from Scripture. The very foundations of human rights and social organization emerge from completely different sources. Educational systems develop along purely classical lines without biblical studies as a central requirement. Universities focus intensely on rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and natural observation. Students learn to think critically about ancient texts without the assumption that any particular book contains ultimate truth. Literature explores themes that were never overshadowed by biblical narratives in this timeline. Epic poems rival Homer rather than trying to create Christian alternatives to pagan stories. Drama develops psychological depth without the moral framework provided by biblical concepts of sin, redemption, and grace. Chapter 9. Reformation Impossible. The year 1517 arrives, but Martin Luther never nails his 95 Theses to any church door because there's no unified biblical authority for him to reform. The Catholic Church has developed as a traditional institution based on apostolic succession and mystical experience rather than biblical interpretation. Different regions follow different versions of Christianity with varying relationships to Roman authority. Instead of the Protestant Reformation that split Christianity in our timeline, Europe experiences entirely different religious upheavals. In northern Germany, followers of ancient Germanic religious traditions clash with various Christian communities that lack unified biblical backing. These conflicts aren't about biblical interpretation, but about completely different visions of spiritual reality. England experiences something like our English Reformation, but for completely different reasons. Henry VIII breaks with Rome not over biblical authority for divorce, but over competing claims about mystical visions and miraculous signs. Without biblical precedent to guide him, Henry creates a church based on royal dreams and court astrologers rather than reformed theology. France faces religious wars between different Catholic mystical schools rather than between Catholics and Protestants. Some French Christians follow visionaries who claim direct revelation from Mary Magdalene. Others support traditional bishops who insist on apostolic authority. Still others join Celtic Christian communities that blend Jesus' teachings with ancient Gallic religious practices. The Netherlands rebels against Spanish rule not for Protestant freedom, but for the right to follow their own unique version of Christianity that incorporates ancient Germanic flood myths into the story of Noah's Ark. Swiss communities develop their own religious practices based on mountain mysticism rather than biblical reform. Without the printing press spreading standardized biblical texts, religious authority remains much more localized and personal. Charismatic leaders claiming direct visions compete with traditional clergy who emphasize ancient rituals. Folk Christianity blends with regional pagan traditions in ways that would have been impossible with strong biblical boundaries. By 1600, Northern Europe has experienced massive religious and political upheaval but along completely different lines than the Protestant Reformation. The result is even more religious fragmentation, but also more spiritual creativity and diversity than our timeline ever experienced. Chapter 10: Colonial Conquest Transformed. When European explorers reached the Americas in 1492 and beyond, they encounter indigenous civilizations without the biblical mandate to spread Christianity to all nations. Spanish conquistadors still seek gold and glory, but they lack the religious justification that made their original conquests so devastating and complete. Without biblical authority commanding them to convert the heathen, European attitudes toward Native American religions develop very differently. Spanish colonists still exploit indigenous labor, but they're more likely to blend Catholic mysticism with local spiritual traditions, rather than trying to completely destroy native beliefs. Aztec and Inca religious practices survive in modified forms that would be unrecognizable in our timeline. Jesuit missionaries in South America focus on practical education and medical care rather than biblical conversion. They learn indigenous languages to understand local wisdom traditions rather than just to translate scripture. Some Jesuits even adopt native spiritual practices that help them connect with the natural world in ways their European training never provided. In North America, English colonists develop different relationships with Native American tribes without biblical concepts of chosen people claiming promised land. Puritan communities still seek religious freedom, but their non-biblical Christianity blends more easily with indigenous seasonal festivals and nature-based spiritual practices. The African slave trade proceeds along different moral lines without biblical justifications for slavery. European slave traders can't quote verses about servants obeying masters or point to biblical slavery as divine precedent. This doesn't stop the slave trade, but it creates different attitudes toward enslaved Africans and their religious practices. African spiritual traditions maintain much stronger integrity during the Middle Passage and plantation slavery. Without biblical Christianity competing with traditional African religions, enslaved communities preserve drumming, ancestral worship, and healing practices that create different forms of resistance and cultural survival. In Asia, European colonization follows alternative patterns when trading companies can't claim biblical authority for their expanding influence. Dutch colonists in Indonesia, British traders in India, and Portuguese merchants in China develop different relationships with local populations when religious conversion isn't a primary goal. The global collision between European and non-European civilizations still creates massive cultural disruption, but along lines that would seem almost alien to our understanding of colonial history. Chapter 11: The Lost Gospels Rise. In our world, the Gospel of Thomas was buried in the Egyptian desert for over 1,500 years. Church authorities called it dangerous heresy because it taught that the kingdom of heaven was already present within every human soul. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene was suppressed because it showed a woman as Jesus' closest disciple and primary interpreter of his secret teachings. The Gospel of Judas was destroyed because it suggested that Judas was actually Jesus' most faithful follower, chosen to help complete the divine plan through betrayal. But in this alternate timeline, these lost Gospels were never lost at all. Without biblical authority to suppress them, the Gospel of Thomas becomes one of the most popular Christian texts across the Mediterranean world. Early Christians gather in house churches to study Jesus' mysterious sayings about finding the light within themselves and recognizing their own divine nature. Mary Magdalene emerges not as a reformed prostitute, but as an equal apostle who received teachings that Jesus never shared with Peter, James, or John. Communities following her gospel develop forms of Christianity that honor both masculine and feminine aspects of the divine. Women serve as priests and bishops in these traditions, claiming direct apostolic succession through Mary rather than through the male disciples. The Gospel of Judas creates entire Christian movements that understand betrayal, suffering, and sacrifice in completely different ways. These communities teach that evil serves divine purposes, and that the greatest faith sometimes requires doing terrible things for higher spiritual reasons. Their ethics become complex and mysterious in ways that mainstream Christianity never allowed. Gnostic Christianity, freed from biblical competition, spreads rapidly across North Africa, Southern Europe, and into Asia. Gnostic teachers claim that salvation comes through secret knowledge rather than faith or good works. They develop elaborate mythologies about multiple heavens, divine emanations, and cosmic battles between light and darkness that make their spiritual universe far more complex and magical than biblical Christianity ever imagined. These alternative gospels don't just change Christian theology, they transform Christian practice. Gnostic Christians meditate for hours, seeking mystical visions. Followers of Mary Magdalene create rituals honoring sacred marriage and divine sexuality. Communities using the Gospel of Thomas develop practices for recognizing Christ consciousness within ordinary daily life. By 800 AD, Christianity has become something completely unrecognizable from our timeline. Instead of one church with biblical authority, there are dozens of Christian movements with different scriptures, different practices, and different understandings of who Jesus was and what salvation means. Chapter 12: Judaism's Hidden Path. Without the pressure of competing with Christian biblical authority, Judaism evolves along mystical pathways that remain hidden in our timeline until much later centuries. The Kabbalah, which historically developed as secret teachings shared only among the most learned rabbis, becomes mainstream Jewish practice much earlier and more openly. Jewish communities in Babylon, freed from the need to define themselves against Christian claims about Hebrew prophecy, dive deep into ancient mystical traditions about the nature of God, the structure of reality, and the human soul's journey through different levels of existence. They develop sophisticated practices for achieving direct communion with the divine that rival anything in Eastern religious traditions. Temple Judaism potentially survives in modified forms without Christian pressure to prove that the temple's destruction fulfilled biblical prophecy. Jewish communities in Palestine maintain sacrificial practices alongside mystical study, creating forms of Judaism that blend ancient ritual with esoteric wisdom in ways our timeline never experienced. Different concepts of the Messiah develop independently across various Jewish communities. Some teach that every generation produces potential messiahs who might establish divine rule if conditions become right. Others develop ideas about collective messiahship, where entire communities can embody divine redemption. Still others move toward more mystical understandings, where messianic consciousness becomes an individual spiritual achievement. Jewish communities maintain much stronger political independence without Christian empires trying to convert or control them. In some regions, Jewish city-states emerge as centers of learning and trade. Jewish scholars become major preservers of ancient wisdom, but they also develop new philosophical and scientific insights that blend Torah study with Greek philosophy and Persian mysticism. The relationship between Jewish law and mystical experience evolves very differently. Without biblical Christianity challenging Jewish legal authority, rabbinical schools develop more flexible approaches to interpreting Torah that incorporate mystical insights about the deeper meanings of commandments and rituals. Alternative interpretations of Moses and the Exodus story flourish without Christian attempts to claim these narratives as prophecies about Jesus. Some Jewish communities develop understandings of Moses as a mystical master who achieved divine consciousness. Others interpret the Exodus as a psychological journey from spiritual slavery to inner freedom that every soul must complete. By 1000 AD, Judaism has become a much more diverse and mystically oriented tradition than anything we recognize from our historical timeline. Chapter 13: Islam's Alternative Genesis. When the Quran emerges through Muhammad's revelations in the early 600s, it develops entirely different theological foundations without biblical context to reference, challenge, or build upon. Islamic scholars can't compare Quranic stories about Abraham, Moses, and Jesus to biblical versions because those biblical versions simply don't exist as unified, authoritative texts. This creates fascinating changes in Islamic development. Quranic interpretations proceed without the need to address Christian claims about Jesus' divinity or Jewish arguments about Hebrew prophecy. Islamic theology becomes more internally focused on the direct relationship between Allah and human souls, rather than defining itself against other monotheistic traditions. The relationship between Islamic communities and local Jewish and Christian groups develops along completely different lines. Without biblical authority for Christians to claim or Jewish communities to defend, interfaith dialogue happens more as exchanges between various mystical traditions, rather than debates over competing scriptural interpretations. Islamic expansion follows alternative justifications and methods. Without biblical concepts of holy war to compete with or adapt, Islamic jihad develops more along the lines of spiritual struggle and community defense, rather than religious conquest. This doesn't make Islamic expansion peaceful, but it changes the motivations and methods in significant ways. Hadith traditions, the collected sayings and actions of Muhammad that supplement the Quran, develop without constant comparison to biblical precedents. This allows Islamic law and practice to evolve more independently, potentially becoming either more flexible or more rigid, depending on local conditions, without the moderating influence of biblical comparison. Sufi mysticism becomes more central to Islamic practice much earlier, without biblical Christianity as a competing mystical tradition. Islamic communities develop sophisticated meditation practices, sacred music, and ecstatic rituals that might have been suppressed in our timeline as too similar to Christian mysticism. The Islamic understanding of previous prophets evolves differently when there are no biblical accounts to reference or reinterpret. Abraham, Moses, and Jesus become more purely Quranic figures, with characteristics that might seem strange or unfamiliar compared to our understanding of these biblical personalities. By 900 AD, Islam has developed into something that shares the Quran with our timeline's Islam, but has grown in directions that would seem almost like a different religion due to the absence of biblical context in its formative centuries. Chapter 14: Eastern Wisdom Goes West. Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism encounter no biblical resistance as they spread westward through trade routes and cultural exchange. European and Middle Eastern populations experiencing religious chaos and fragmentation become much more open to Eastern philosophical and spiritual systems that offer different approaches to life's fundamental questions. Buddhist monasteries established throughout medieval Europe centuries earlier than in our timeline. Tibetan Buddhist practices of meditation and compassion training appeal to former Christians seeking spiritual discipline without the theological complexity of competing Christian sects. European Buddhist communities develop unique characteristics as they blend mindfulness practices with local customs and wisdom traditions. Hindu concepts of reincarnation, karma, and multiple paths to enlightenment spread to Western philosophical schools that no longer have biblical concepts of linear time, final judgment, and single lifetime salvation to compete with. European thinkers begin exploring ideas about consciousness, reality, and spiritual development that won't appear in our timeline until the modern era. Taoist principles about natural harmony, effortless action, and balance between opposing forces influence European political systems in unexpected ways. Some European communities experiment with forms of governance based on Taoist ideals of minimal intervention and working with natural social flows rather than imposing rigid biblical-based legal systems. Meditation and yoga become Western practices much earlier, spreading through European monasteries and philosophical schools that are seeking alternatives to fragmented Christian contemplative traditions. European practitioners develop their own approaches to Eastern practices, creating hybrid spiritual systems that blend Asian wisdom with Celtic, Germanic, and Mediterranean cultural elements. Alternative concepts of afterlife and soul development replace biblical ideas about heaven, hell, and resurrection. European populations begin thinking about death and spiritual progress in terms of reincarnation cycles, bardos between lives, and gradual enlightenment across multiple existences rather than single judgment after death. The exchange goes both directions. Eastern teachers encounter European mystical traditions, Celtic nature spirituality, and Mediterranean mystery schools that offer different insights into spiritual development. Buddhist and Hindu philosophers incorporate Western logical methods and scientific observation into their traditional practices. By 1200 AD, the spiritual landscape of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East includes thriving Eastern religious communities that have fundamentally altered how Western populations think about consciousness, ethics, and the purpose of human existence. Chapter 15: The Forbidden Texts Revealed. Ancient texts that were suppressed by biblical authority in our timeline become widely known and influential without that suppression. The Book of Enoch, which describes detailed hierarchies of angels and the secrets of fallen angels who taught humanity forbidden knowledge, spreads throughout Jewish and Christian communities as accepted scripture. Enoch's revelations about watchers, Nephilim giants, and cosmic battles between good and evil angels create forms of Judaism and Christianity that are much more magical and mythologically complex than biblical religion ever allowed. Communities study Enochian texts to understand angelic names, celestial calendars, and techniques for communicating with heavenly beings. The Testament of Solomon, which claims to record King Solomon's methods for binding and commanding demons, becomes a major text for Christian and Jewish magical practices. Without biblical authorities condemning such practices as forbidden sorcery, European communities develop sophisticated traditions of spiritual warfare, protective rituals, and communication with supernatural beings. Gnostic revelations about multiple heavens, divine emanations, and secret knowledge for ascending through cosmic levels become mainstream spiritual teachings rather than hidden heresies. European monasteries preserve and study texts like the Pistis Sophia, the books of Zhu, and other Gnostic scriptures that describe the soul's journey through various spiritual realms. Alternative creation stories compete openly with the Genesis account, creating much more diverse understandings of how the universe began and humanity's role within it. Some communities follow creation myths that describe multiple gods working together. Others adopt stories about divine sparks trapped in matter who must remember their true nature to return to the light. Occult knowledge develops without biblical prohibition as communities study texts about astrology, alchemy, sacred geometry, and communication with spiritual beings. European universities include magical arts alongside philosophy and natural science as legitimate fields of study rather than dangerous practices that threaten biblical faith. The result is a European civilization that openly embraces what our timeline called the occult as normal spiritual practice. By 1300 AD, European communities routinely practice forms of magic, mysticism, and spiritual communication that were driven underground or eliminated entirely in our historical development. Chapter 16: Technology without Scripture. Modern science and technology develop without centuries of biblical influence, shaping ethical boundaries and research priorities. The scientific revolution proceeds along completely different lines when researchers don't have to navigate biblical accounts of creation, flood geology, or human special creation in the divine image. Genetic engineering advances much faster without religious restrictions based on biblical concepts of humans being made in God's image. Scientists modify human DNA, create new species, and experiment with consciousness enhancement without having to address theological concerns about playing God or violating divine creation plans. Artificial intelligence development proceeds without concepts of souls, divine image, or special human spiritual status that might restrict how machines can be designed or what capabilities they might develop. AI systems advance toward consciousness and creativity without the ethical frameworks that biblical anthropology provided in our timeline. Space exploration lacks biblical prophecy about end times, divine judgment, or humanity's special role in cosmic history. Instead of seeing space as God's creation to be explored with reverence and responsibility, space development focuses purely on resource extraction, colonization, and technological advancement without transcendent meaning or moral restraint. Bioethics develops from purely philosophical, utilitarian, or alternative religious principles rather than biblical concepts of human dignity, sanctity of life, or stewardship responsibilities. Medical research proceeds with different assumptions about consciousness, death, and the value of individual versus collective welfare. Genetic modification and bioengineering advance without biblical restrictions, but also without biblical motivations to heal the sick and care for the suffering. Some medical developments happen faster, but others might happen more slowly, without the ethical imperative that biblical concepts of compassion and healing provided. Environmental technology develops without biblical concepts of stewardship, dominion, or responsibility for creation care. Some environmental protection happens through Eastern religious concepts of natural harmony or philosophical arguments about sustainability. But the specific ethical framework that biblical stewardship provided disappears entirely. Technology viewing consciousness, death, and human purpose through completely different spiritual and philosophical frameworks creates innovations and applications that would seem either miraculous or terrifying compared to our timeline's technological development. Chapter 17: Politics of the Godless. Modern democratic systems develop without biblical concepts of individual dignity, natural law, divine authority, or prophetic criticism of unjust rulers. Political structures emerge from purely humanistic, philosophical, or alternative religious foundations that create very different understandings of government, rights, and social organization. Human rights concepts derive from sources other than biblical teaching about humans being created in God's image with inherent dignity and worth. Some rights concepts come from Eastern religious ideas about universal Buddha nature or Hindu concepts of divine consciousness in all beings. Others emerge from purely philosophical arguments about rational autonomy or social contract theory. Democracy develops without Protestant concepts about individual conscience, personal relationship with divine authority, or the priesthood of all believers that historically supported democratic participation. Instead, democratic theory might emerge from classical republican ideals, Eastern concepts about collective wisdom, or mystical teachings about shared divine consciousness. Capitalism emerges with different moral justifications without the Protestant work ethic, biblical concepts about stewardship of resources, or religious teachings about serving others through honest labor. Economic systems develop based on purely secular theories about efficiency, power, or alternative religious concepts about abundance and sharing. Social justice movements proceed without biblical prophetic traditions about defending the poor, welcoming strangers, or divine judgment against oppressive systems. Justice concepts emerge from philosophical reasoning, alternative religious teachings about compassion and equality, or purely practical arguments about social stability and human flourishing. International law develops without Christian just war theory, biblical concepts about peace between nations, or religious teachings about universal human brotherhood under divine authority. Global governance emerges from purely practical needs for trade coordination, conflict resolution, and resource management without transcendent moral frameworks. The result is political systems that might be more rational and efficient in some ways, but also potentially more brutal and dehumanizing, without the specific ethical constraints and positive visions that biblical political thought provided to Western democratic development. Chapter 18: The Digital Age, Spiritual Crisis. In our timeline, people facing modern anxiety, digital overwhelm, and existential meaninglessness often turn to biblical faith for anchor points of purpose, community, and transcendent hope. Without this spiritual resource, humanity confronts 21st century challenges with entirely different coping mechanisms and meaning-making systems. Mental health approaches develop based on Eastern meditation traditions, philosophical reasoning, or therapeutic techniques, rather than biblical counseling approaches that address sin, forgiveness, redemption, and divine love. Some psychological healing happens through mindfulness practices, rational cognitive therapy, or community healing rituals based on alternative spiritual traditions. Online communities form around completely different spiritual practices and belief systems. Instead of Christian social media groups, digital communities organize around Buddhist meditation networks, neo-pagan nature spirituality, philosophical discussion groups, or mystical schools that blend various non-biblical traditions. Social media platforms influence different types of religious and spiritual movements. Without biblical Christianity as a major organizing force, online spiritual influence spreads through Eastern gurus, philosophical teachers, neo-shamanic practitioners, or charismatic leaders of various mystical communities, rather than Christian pastors and biblical teachers. Digital addiction and social media anxiety get addressed through frameworks other than biblical teachings about contentment, community, purpose, and eternal perspective. Some healing happens through Buddhist teachings about attachment and desire. Other approaches use Stoic philosophy, nature-based spirituality, or purely secular therapeutic techniques. Global crises like climate change, economic inequality, and political polarization get addressed without biblical frameworks about stewardship, justice, prophetic criticism, and hope for divine intervention or ultimate restoration. Alternative religious and philosophical systems provide different resources for meaning-making and collective action during times of crisis. The existential challenges of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration, and potential immortality technologies get addressed without biblical concepts about human purpose, divine image, eternal life, or ultimate accountability. Humanity faces these challenges with Eastern concepts about consciousness, philosophical reasoning about ethics, or alternative spiritual frameworks about cosmic evolution and human development. The result is a digital age that handles modern challenges through completely different spiritual, psychological, and ethical resources than our timeline provides. Chapter 19. What we lost, what we gained. As we stand at the edge of this alternate reality, we must grapple with profound questions that challenge everything we assume about human civilization and spiritual development. Would humanity be more compassionate without biblical concepts of divine judgment, creating fear and exclusion? Or would we be less compassionate without biblical teachings about loving enemies and caring for the least among us? Looking at moral development across this alternate timeline, we see fascinating trade-offs. Without biblical concepts of universal human dignity, some societies develop more hierarchical and brutal systems based on pure power or efficiency. But without biblical concepts of divine wrath and eternal punishment, other societies develop more tolerant and inclusive approaches to human difference and moral failure. The psychological impact of different afterlife concepts shapes human behavior in surprising ways. People living with Eastern concepts about reincarnation and gradual enlightenment across multiple lifetimes sometimes become more patient and long-term focused in their ethical development. But they might also become less urgent about addressing immediate suffering and injustice. Alternative concepts about consciousness and spiritual reality create different approaches to mental illness, addiction, and psychological healing. Some communities develop more sophisticated understanding of meditation, energy healing, and holistic wellness without biblical concepts about sin and spiritual warfare, creating shame and fear around psychological problems. The question of whether love, forgiveness, and sacrifice would exist without biblical examples becomes crucial. We see that human capacity for selfless love appears across all cultures and spiritual traditions. But the specific forms that biblical agape love took, loving enemies, forgiving repeatedly, sacrificial service, might be much rarer without those particular religious teachings and examples. Different concepts about the meaning and purpose of human life create alternative approaches to suffering, achievement, and relationships. Some people find deeper meaning through Eastern teachings about enlightenment and liberation from suffering. Others discover purpose through philosophical reasoning about human flourishing and ethical excellence. Still others create meaning through mystical experiences and communion with spiritual beings. But something profound might be missing. The biblical vision of ultimate justice, complete healing, and perfect love restored across all creation provided a hope that transcended individual enlightenment or philosophical reasoning. Without that particular hope, human beings might achieve great wisdom and compassion, but still lack the specific comfort and motivation that biblical promises about resurrection, restoration, and eternal joy provided to billions of people across our timeline. Chapter 20. The manuscript that changes everything. Deep beneath a forgotten monastery in the mountains of Ethiopia, archaeologists make a discovery that shouldn't exist. Hidden in a sealed chamber that hasn't been opened for over 1,000 years, they find something impossible. A complete biblical manuscript, written in pristine condition, dated 200 AD. Centuries before our alternate timeline says biblical compilation was supposed to have failed. But this isn't just any biblical manuscript. As scholars examine the ancient text with growing amazement and terror, they realize it contains books and passages that don't exist in our modern Bible. Entire Gospels describe Jesus performing miracles that were never recorded. Prophetic books detail events that seem to describe our current world with impossible accuracy. Letters from apostles contain teachings that would revolutionize everything we thought we knew about Christianity. The most shocking discovery comes in the final pages. Hidden in the book of Revelation are prophecies that seem to describe exactly the alternate timeline we've been exploring. Ancient verses speak of a time when the sacred words shall be scattered, and the nations shall seek truth in darkness. Other passages describe false wisdoms from the sunrise lands, and the children of the promise walking in confusion without the lamp unto their feet. But the final prophecy sends chills through everyone who reads it. In the latter days, when the sealed words are opened, the watchers shall know that both paths were walked, and neither timeline holds the fullness of truth. The real revelation comes when the hidden manuscript bridges the worlds that were and were not. As news of the discovery spreads, scholars around the world begin asking terrifying questions. If this manuscript existed in 200 AD, why did biblical compilation fail in this alternate timeline? Was the failure deliberate, part of some larger spiritual plan that required humanity to experience both biblical and non-biblical development? Are there other hidden manuscripts that reveal even more shocking alternatives about human spiritual history? The most disturbing possibility emerges from quantum physicists studying the manuscript's unusual properties. Some evidence suggests that this isn't just an ancient text, but somehow a bridge between different versions of reality, our timeline, and the alternate timeline we've been exploring. If multiple timelines actually exist simultaneously, then everything we've discovered about the world without the Bible isn't just speculation. It's a real world where real people lived, suffered, and sought meaning through completely different spiritual paths. The manuscript ends with words that seem written directly for our modern world. The children of both timelines shall meet when the final page is turned. Then shall be revealed which path leads home, and which path leads to the deeper mystery that encompasses all paths. The story is not finished. The real question is just beginning. As archaeologists prepare to reveal more hidden chambers beneath the monastery, as scientists study the impossible properties of the ancient text, And as spiritual seekers around the world grapple with the implications of parallel spiritual realities, one thing becomes clear. Our exploration of the world without the Bible has led us to questions that challenge the very nature of reality, spirituality, and human destiny itself. The manuscript suggests that somewhere, in dimensions we can barely imagine, the story continues. And perhaps the next chapter of human spiritual evolution requires understanding not just what happened, but what could have happened, and what might still be happening in realities beyond our current comprehension. The journey into the world without the Bible has become a doorway into mysteries that make our original questions seem small compared to the vast spiritual adventure that still lies ahead.